I'm a Microsoft MVP regional director. I'm based in New Zealand, Auckland. You guys call it Auckland. That doesn't matter really. I'm author of some Power BI books. One of them is free, available in RADACAD website, Power BI from Rookie to Rockstar. Feel free to go and download it from there. And some other books that you can find it in like Amazon mainly.
Reza, you're not qualified, are you, to be teaching?
No. I used to be MCT, but then I gave up.
Oh man, that was it.
Yeah, and I haven't still passed the, what is that, DA 100 exam, Microsoft. So I'm not really a Power BI certified expert. We can call it this way.
You're an expert in our book.
I'm also author of some Power BI video courses books. Sorry, not books, video courses, which feel free to reach out to me if you want to know more about those. And that's pretty much about me. These are my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'll be more than happy to know about the scenario you are working with Power BI and try to help as much as I can. Now, the topic today is moving your Power Query tables or queries into the Dataflow. Now, some of you might be familiar with Dataflow, some of you might not. So I'll start this with the beginning of what the Dataflow is and then how it can help and how we can move our queries up into the Dataflow. To understand Dataflow in the best way, it's important to understand what type of persona of the user we have who is using Power BI. Let's imagine this person. Let's imagine we have a single developer, single business analyst in a team, or let's say in the whole organization. It might be the only developer person who is building the Power BI solution. This person might have like multiple users, but he or she is the only person who built the Power BI solution. For that kind of scenario, Power BI is really simple because you can use Power BI Desktop. It's a free tool. You can use it to get data from different places, do some data transformations, load it into the Power BI, create relationships between tables, write DAX expressions, measures, calculations, visualize it, whatever you want, and then publish it to a workspace in Power BI and share it through Power BI apps with your users, right? The good thing about this is that everything happens in one Power BI file, which makes it really simple to maintain. Later on, if the developer needs to make changes, just open that PBIX file, apply changes, publish it again. It's easy to maintain, it's agile, everything is fast and easy. Now, this would be a little bit different if we have a different type of user. Let's say if we have a persona of a team of developers. Now we are talking about multiple developers working on the same Power BI file. Or let's say we are talking about one developer working on multiple Power BI files. They are kind of the same. And this would change the scenario a little bit. If we work with like one single Power BI file, there would be a lot of challenges in that scenario. Let's say me and Paul, we are both working on one Power BI file. How we are going to develop it at the same time? We cannot really do that because if we make changes at the same time and save it, we have to merge it. At the moment, there is no really good built-in way of merging Power BI files, which cause a lot of problems. So what I have to do is I have to open Power BI file, apply my changes, save it, share it with Paul. He applies some changes, share it with me. And what happens if in the middle of that, suddenly I applied another change and saved it, right? It would be really a big mess to control it. And you have only like one developer working with Power BI file at the same time, at one time. So that means that you end up like with one Power BI file, bringing things into that. Your file will grow bigger and bigger. You start with, let's say, 2 tables, then 20 tables, then 200 tables. I've seen Power BI files with over hundreds of tables and like so many relationships, over hundreds of measures, over thousands of measures I have seen even. When you just open that Power BI file, it takes like 20 minutes just to load it into the system. And when you say create a new measure or even edit a measure, it takes like 5 minutes to bring that DAX editor for you up so you can write something in it. it becomes really hard to maintain it, like tons of visualization pages, right? This is not a really ideal solution to work with Power BI. It would be a really high maintenance problem and a lot of duplicate codes and things like that. And now let's take one of these challenges in that scenario. One of the challenges is that when you want to use a table in multiple files, how you are going to do that. And a table in the world of Power BI, or let's say Power Query, is called query. So using a table or a query in multiple files. Imagine this scenario. Let's say I am a Power BI developer, let's say in my organization, and the sales team came to me and asked, can you do like some reporting on our sales data? I said, yep, I can do that. And then I go and build some tables based on the data, the input data coming. Like I build a table for customers, a table, populated from the source, of course, and then clean it up. And then a table for date, that's pretty general table. You use it in most of BI systems. A table for sales transaction, a table for product. Now, some of these tables might not be just like one table when I fetch it from the source system. Product, for example, might be a bunch of tables bundled together. Like in the source system, in the operational system, it was product itself, product color, product brand, product category. All of those tables, I merged them in Power Query together. I cleaned up some data. I did some data transformations and ended up with a clean product table, which I'm using in that sales file. I built my solution, let's say, into 3 months and deliver it to the sales team. They are happy with that. They go and talk with other teams that this is the report we got. Then the warehouse team come to me and say, we also want a report on our warehouse inventory movement and things like that. I say, yep, I can do that. And then I go and build a new file. Why new file? Because this is going to be totally different things. And let's say warehouse team might not be authorized to know about the sales data. So I'm going to build totally different things. Now, in that new Power BI file, I have new tables such as warehouse, such as inventory movement. But I also need some tables that I used to create in the sales file, such as product table, that product table that I spent so much time to create it, or the date table that is pretty generic. So what I'm going to do in that scenario, if I need a table in multiple files, one way, of course, is to go to your first Power BI file, copy that Power Query, MS script, or the whole query, and paste it here in the new file, which is what a lot of people are doing. It's kind of a workaround. It's not really a solution. Why it is not a solution? Because now, after doing this copy, you'll get exactly that table that you want. That is not a problem. But then you have 2 different versions of your source code. It's not really great, because if after a couple of weeks you realize that in your product table or in your date table you missed a couple of steps, you want to add those steps, then you have to go and add it in both files. And it's not always 2 files. You end up with like 5 files, 10 files. So you have to remember that you go to every one of those 10 files and change it, right? That's going to be quite a bit of maintenance work. That's one thing. Another thing is that, like that product table, let's say it took some time to process that because I merged some tables together. I cleaned up that data. Let's say, usually it shouldn't be like that, but let's say it takes like 10 minutes that product table to be produced with that data transformation that I built. Now, why should I do that like 10 minutes in the sales file, 10 minutes in the inventory file and some other places? Why I don't transform it once and just load it into the Power BI file again and again, right? These are challenges that you can easily solve with Dataflow. Now, what is a Dataflow? Dataflow is defined as a Power Query process runs in cloud independent from Power BI reports. Or I've heard some people call it as Power Query Online. It's not really exactly what Power Query Online is, because Power Query Online means that whatever exactly you get in Power Query Desktop, it is the online version of that. It's a little bit different than that. I would call it as Power Query as a service, because you can have your Power Query processes running in the cloud, and it is independent from Power BI report. The most important part of this definition is this being independent from Power BI. It can be like totally independent from Power BI. You can use Dataflow for, let's say, Power Platform and don't do anything with Power BI about it. consider it as totally separate thing. Now, in this session, we are talking about like Power BI data flows, which is kind of bundled with Power BI somehow, but it is independent. That means that in Power Query, in Power BI desktop, when your query runs, when the data loads into a destination, that destination is actually your Power BI data model. The analysis services engine in that in-memory data model is your destination when you have Power BI dataset. But when you have Dataflow, the destination is not Power BI data model. Destination is somewhere else. And what it is at the moment Azure Data Lake storage. And in this session, as I said, we are talking about Power BI data flows. Azure Data Lake storage is the option for that. If we are talking about Power Platform data flows, Common Data Services, or the new name, Dataflex Pro is the storage option for that. But focusing on Power BI, Azure Data Lake. And how it is stored in a bunch of folders. Like we have one folder for, let's say, workspace. And under that, we have folders for data flows. Under that, we have folders for entities. And we have like entities stored, the data of entities is stored as a CSV format. Now, when I talk about this, one of the first questions I get is that, well, I don't really have a data lake subscription. So what I should do? The thing is that you don't need a subscription. You don't even need any Azure subscription at all. If you have a separate Azure Data Lake subscription, you can bind it to Dataflow, and we call that external data flows. But you don't need to. You can use your normal Power BI account, let's say Power BI Pro or Power BI Premium. With these accounts, you have some space in Power BI service. Part of that space can be internal Azure Data Lake storage, then that you can use for this Power BI. So you don't really need any other licenses for that. However, like depends on the license you have for Power BI or Power Platform, you have different abilities, different things you can do with the data flows. Now, what is the whole story then? I run Power Query in the cloud, I store it in Azure Data Lake storage, and then what? Then Power BI can get data from that data flow. So instead of Power BI doing all of those heavy lifting transformations, instead of having the concept or let's say the source code of those transformations in Power BI, we have that in the data flow. Consider it as a separate ETL service, extract, transform, load service. It runs on the cloud. It stores the data in a destination. Consider it as like a database storage. And then with Power BI, we get data from there. This helps a lot in that scenario that I explained to you. Like this scenario, I had two different files. In those files, I needed a date table or even product table. All of those tables that I need to be in there, I can actually put them in a data flow. In one data flow, you can have one or more tables, as many as you want. The source code is only in that data flow. So when I have like my date dimension, the source code is there. It's not in my Power BI files. It processes it once. It doesn't process it like per Power BI file. So it's better in terms of performance, better in terms of maintaining the code. And then as many as places I want, I can go and just get data from that data flow, which is basically I'm getting data from that database, that CSV file that the data is stored in. So it helps a lot in that scenario. Now, this also, sorry, helps in making the refresh time faster, because sometimes you might have a really long, let's say, running Power Query expression. It takes like, let's say 20 minutes, 25 minutes because of, let's say, the data source is slow, because the transformations you have applied are quite expensive transformations. It takes quite a bit of time to process it. And whenever you want to refresh your Power BI desktop to continue just your normal development work, you have to wait like half an hour. You can push that part of transformation, which is heavy lifting transformation, into a data flow. And then Power BI just get data from the transformed result already. Now, the overall refresh time might be still the same, right? I'm not talking about the overall refresh time here, but your Power BI desktop refresh time would be faster, definitely, because this is already processed. You are just getting data from it. However, there are also ways to make even the overall refresh time faster using some computed entities and enhanced compute engine, which I'll talk about that a little bit later. Another benefit of using Dataflow is you can actually use this to build a data warehouse, a centralized data warehouse. Now, whenever I talk about this, I get questions from some people that, like, I have a SQL Server database as my data warehouse. I have Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Data Warehouse or Synapse, whatever. And I'm using, let's say, some ETL tools, like I'm using stored procedure to feed data into that. I'm using SSIS, I'm using Azure Data Factory. How Dataflow is going to help with that? Well, consider it this way. Consider it this way that we have a lot of users of Power BI that don't have the luxury that you have. They don't have a license for Azure SQL Database. They don't have a license for SSIS, or if they want to pay for it, it's going to be quite a bit of expense. But they can use Dataflow without paying anything extra, right? They get all of that as part of Power BI, right? They can use that to build their pipelines of data transformations as different data flows, and then they can load it into Azure Data Lake storage. That becomes like their place of having tables. And you can also define some relationship between these tables if you want to. There are some metadata files to do that. So you can really build something only with Dataflow if you want to. Okay. Now, enough of a slide. Let me talk about that on a demo showing you what the data flow is and how you can do move your queries over there. So first,
I just want to mention, if people have questions or if there are, if you want me to pause Reza, just, point them in the chat or let us know.
Let me do this first demo and then I'll check what questions are.
Cool.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. So the first thing about data flow creation you should know is that this is not something you can create in Power BI desktop. It is a service-only feature, so you have to go and build it in the Power BI service. Now, this is a Power BI file that I have, a sample Power BI file. It's a sales file. I have a sales table, customer table, and product table. Now, let's say I want to also have a date table here, right? Now, Power BI has its own version of date table. It's a built-in date table, but the date table that I want, I need to have some like fiscal columns in it, some public holidays, things like that. So I'm not going to use that built-in date table. I have a script that I can use for creating a date table, and you can just copy this script from my blog. Just go and search for Power Query date dimension script. You'll get the entire script. If I copy this script and come here and start with a blank query, this will give me like a date table without any problem. But I'm not going to do that here, because if I do that, then the source code of building this date table is part of my Power BI file here. And then if I need it in another file, I have to do exactly the same. So my source code is spread everywhere. So what I'm going to do is to build that date table in a data flow. Now, to build the data flow, you have to be in the service. So here I am in a service, in a workspace, in an organizational workspace, not in my workspace. And then here you can just create a data flow just like that. I can create a data flow. There are different ways to create it. We'll just start with this at the moment, defining new entities. Entities basically are tables. And this will bring what we call as Power Query Online experience, right? So Power Query Online is part of Dataflow. It's not like Power Query Online is Dataflow. So this will bring Power Query Online experience. This is similar to Get Data experience in Power BI Desktop. You have all different sources you can choose and get data from it. Like, for example, I can choose SQL Server database. I can write the server address and database. If it is on-premises source, I need to set on-premises gateway. That is one of the things that is a little bit different from using Power Query in Power BI Desktop, because at the beginning of that, you don't need a gateway. But here, even from the beginning, you do need that, even if your data source is on-prem, because there's no other way that this cloud service can connect to your on-prem data. Now for this example, because I have the query, I'm just using this option, the blank query. Blank query, I can just paste my query over here. This is the Power Query script for creating date dimension. I have the from year to year. I can change these. I can change what is the start of fiscal year, what is the first day of week. I can customize these, but I'll leave it as is for now. I don't need a gateway for this because this is just generated based on a loop structure. I'll go next. And this will bring the Power Query editor online experience for me, which I'll see the table with all the different data entries in it, all the transformations listed here, transformations steps. I can do further transformations if I want to. I can go ahead and do some other transformations, or I can just leave it as is here, which I'm just going to call it date at the moment. Nothing really special. Now, in one data flow, you can have multiple tables. I can even build my product table here. I can build another table here, right? But I'm going to just stick with this table at the moment, save this and close. And this example I'm showing to you is with Power BI Pro account, right? So one of the questions might be that, do I need premium for using Dataflow? No, you can see that even with Pro, you can use that. So I'm going to call this Portland Pog Dataflow. Another difference between Dataflow and using Power Query in Power BI Desktop is that when you use Power Query in Power BI Desktop, as soon as you close and apply, you get the data loaded into the Power BI dataset. Here, after building my data flow, the data is not loaded into this table yet. I have to refresh it in order to get data into this table or set of tables. So I'm going to do that refresh. What did I call it? I called it, I think, Portland. Yeah, let's search. Search is a good thing. Okay, so here it is. I find it. So I just refresh it. You can refresh it, schedule it to refresh, similar to Power BI dataset. You can schedule it to refresh like 8 times a day with Pro, 48 times a day with Premium, or you can have as many as REST API calls if you have a dedicated capacity. Now I'll just do the manual refresh. While that is refreshing, I come back here into the Power BI desktop and say get data. I'll choose Power BI data flows. If you don't have it in your command list of data sources, this is under more and under, coming slowly, under Power Platform. Here we have that as well. And you notice that we also have something called Power Platform data flows. It shouldn't be beta anymore, but yeah, still it is. So that's another thing which I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Let's, for now, select Power BI data flows, connect. It will ask for your credentials the first time you are doing that. I've already done that, so it has my credential. It checks all the workspaces that there's a data flow on it, and I have access to this. So these are all of those workspaces. I'll expand this one, which was the workspace I created that data
Reza,
flow
there
on.
was one quick question. If you can't create workspaces, like if it's locked down by your IT group, can you still create data flows, or they?
If you have edit rights on the workspace, yes. And by edit rights, it means that you should be either contributor, member, or administrator.
So contributor and member can still create data flows.
Yes, yeah, correct. Okay, so I'll select that data flow, and you see my date table here. It's like a database, right? If I had more tables, I would have seen all of those tables here as well. And you can select like one table coming from this data flow, another coming from that data flow. I'm going to select this date table. Now imagine this persona. Let's say I am a data modeler. And by data modeler, I mean I don't know anything about Power Query. I know about DAX, I know about relationships, but I don't know anything about Power Query. I know that I need a date table in order to get some date-based analysis here, but I don't know how to create a date table. On the other hand side, someone already created a date table in my organization, and they said that we shared it with you in a data flow. So I just go there and select it without even knowing how this date table is built. That knowledge is like totally abstract. That part is totally abstract, and I don't really care how this is built because I'm the user of this table. I'm just loading this. Then after loading this into the Power BI, I can create relationship to other tables like any other data sources you use and start doing analysis with that. I am totally separate from the person who built that data flow. Now we can have like same person doing all of these things together, but it doesn't need to be the same person. So here is my data table, and I can go ahead and create relationship and do the rest of the things. Now I'm going to stop here, pause for a second, and see if there's any questions before continuing.
Yeah, we're still going back and forth on, I think the administrator and data flows. Chris mentioned, if you have pro and premium, then the member admin rights, you can create data flows. But Chris, are you saying that if you have pro but not premium, you can't be a member to create a data flow?
That's a good question. I never actually tried that. I was always using it with premium. So I didn't think so because there's a capacity workload that is data flows. So I don't know what it would run under unless it's running under the public data flows capacity. But
yeah,
I've never tried it.
Pro, it runs under public.
Okay.
Yeah, if you are pro, it would be creating that in that, let's say, shared capacity space, and you would be able to have the member access or contributor access or admin access to build that data flow, but it won't be under a dedicated capacity, of course.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. And then I see Mark is asking a question. Have they resolved the sharing ability when using Gen 2 storage? We had to revert to Gen 1 due to these limitations.
Okay, are you using your like your own Gen 2 storage bind with the data flow, or you are using the internal storage?
Mark, feel free to jump off mute.
Sure. Let me get my mic down. Yeah, so we're using our own Gen 2 storage. That's what we set up initially. So when Gen 2 storage came out, we said, oh, let's use Gen 2 so other systems could leverage the same, data store. But then we could only the person that created the data flow could actually leverage the data flow unless you went and granted permissions in the back end, Azure, side of things. So we reverted back to Gen 1 just so we could share it with other people's other than just the creators of the data flows.
Yeah, the let's say the owner of data flow is still a bit of, let's say, challenge right now, like who is the owner and how to pass ownership of the data flow. But still, being able to like contribute in a data flow is kind of a possible option. The ownership part is, let's say, I'd say under work in progress. So hopefully we'll have something better on that.
Sure. Now that answers the question. Yeah, Gen 1 works how we would expect it to work. It was just Gen 2, seemed to have those limitations still.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely right.
That was as the bring your own storage, Mark, or just as a connection for a data flow?
A connection for the data flow. So in the testing that I did, and this has been probably a year, but in the testing I did initially, we created the data flow and wanted other business units to share that data, same data flow, like for example, a date table, right? So you create one date table, you want everybody within the organization to use that date table, but you couldn't really share that using Gen 2 storage. My understanding is you couldn't share that unless you went into the Gen 2 storage in Azure and granted permissions there, whereas Power BI and Gen 1 storage, you can just add them within the workspace, and then they could actually consume that date dimension.
Unless yeah, that experience is a little bit different across those two still for now.
Well, Ron here. Reza, I have been under the impression that Gen 2 storage was a requirement for data flows. It is. I mean,
if you are connecting your own external storage, yes.
Okay. Right, and with using that, my understanding is you basically had to use a super account to do all that work.
Let me also show it to you here that like in Dataflow settings here. So this is the place that you would connect your Gen 2 ADLS
Right. And that's what we tried and then had to revert back to Gen 1.
Yeah.
I've seen.
We recently went through this in a project, and so my understanding is that when you use Dataflows, it's internally storing data in Gen 1 storage, but you don't have access to those storage files. Is that right, Reza?
The internal storage, you mean?
Yeah,
yes.
The internal storage.
Yeah.
But if you want access to the actual files, then that's when you're going to bring your own storage using Gen 2, and that actually gives you access to those text files in the back end. And there is the challenge of who owns that, what permissions are set on them. But that's when you have to bring your own storage.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like for let's say external data flows, it gives you the ability to then connect to that from other tools and services, not just from Power BI.
Right. Azure Data Factory is what we were, wanting to try to leverage.
Yeah, the internal data flows, like those that you use with the internal storage, is just good for, let's say, Power BI. Even you can't use the result of that in Power Platform, which is a little like problem at the moment.
Reza, I think it would be helpful for you to speak to the implications of bring your own storage. It is pretty much an all or nothing, correct?
Yeah, you can say like I'm using my own storage, and then for other parts I'm using like the shared storage. Is that what you are saying?
Yeah, I think people need to be aware that when you make that switch, you no longer can take advantage of the Microsoft hosted data flows.
Yeah, exactly. So like you have to choose one of your storage options is that you have to choose, are you going to use the internal storage, which is like the data flow by default, the external storage when you connect your own Azure Data Lake storage, and then everything would be under that, or even like Common Data Services, which is more on Power Platform side, or Dataflex Pro, let's call it.
Oh man, the word Dataflex.
It's gonna be hard to
I know we have
digest.
a couple more. I know we have a couple more questions. Mark, did you want to go off mute and ask something real quick?
Yes, thank you. So trying to understand from an architecture standpoint when and how to use data flows. So I've got a large PBIX model, and so the question is, when does it make sense? And so my question is, we're breaking apart the data PBIX file from reports to try and kind of clean things up. But now the data PBIX file is kind of growing as far as tables. And so I'm trying to get a sense of architecturally how to make decisions, when to start splitting off kind of groups of tables, potentially into their own data flows. I guess fundamentally, how should I start to think of using data flows kind of in the architecture of how I build my systems?
Yep, sure. I have actually a few slides on that, so I'll get to that point through the rest of presentation, if that's okay.
Yes, great. Thank you.
Okay. And one last one. I know we want to get going, but Chewy said, do you think creating, maintaining data flows should be done by end users? And I believe you had mentioned that whoever creates the data flow is the one that has to maintain it. But I think, Chewy, you're saying, should it be the business users rather than the workspace owners? Or do you want to go off mute and maybe add some color to that? If you're still on.
Maybe he doesn't have the mic, but I'll explain on my side anyway. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have the microphone set up. I've actually written a blog post and a video with that about roles in the Power BI environment, the way that it changed. One of the things is that the person who built Dataflow needs to have a good understanding of how to shape data, how to prepare the data, how to get data from different places, how to merge it, how to append it, clean up the data, all of these knowledge. Also, Power Query, is simple in terms of the graphical interface, and some business users might be able to still do that. However, I don't consider this as a task for a business user. I would consider it as a task for a data engineer. Now, data engineer shouldn't be like a person who knows SQL scripting or database. Knowing those are good, beneficial, but this person is a person who can understand tables, the relationships, and Power Query mainly to build that structure.
Sweet. Thanks, Reza.
Okay, you're welcome. So I'll continue, and then we'll check more questions again. How much time I have left? Like 10 minutes?
You got like 15 minutes.
Okay.
A little bit more than 15 minutes.
Right. Oh, one other thing I haven't mentioned in my demos is that, so you've seen that in that demo I showed you, I managed to just create a data flow with one, let me go back to my data flow, with one query. I just copied that query. Let me bring that data flow again. I just copied that query and then went there to
name of that flow.
Went there and created the table. Now, what if you have like a Power BI file full of different tables and things like that? What you would do for that scenario? So here I have actually another Power BI file I'm going to open, and that Power BI file has a bunch of queries in it. I even have like examples of a Power Query with functions. Let me bring that. That would probably be better. So I'll close one of these. So many Power BI files open at the same time. So this one close. Not this one. And not this one as well. Still waiting for this to open. So this is this file that I'm going to open for you. It's one of the files that I use normally in my Power Query trainings, and it has a bunch of actually tables in it. Most of these are used for like showing different capabilities we have in Power Query. So here you see that I have like a bunch of tables. Now, some of them are like having with this exclamation mark because the source is not configured and things like that. Now, what you do if you have a file with like 200 tables and you want to create a data flow for that with that? Do you need to go like to every file, advanced editor, copy a script? That works, but you don't really need to do that. You can actually select as many as tables you want, just like this. Hold the Control key and select them, just like that. And then Control C, that's a copy from there. When you come here, you just click somewhere here and then Control V. Now my system is getting a little bit slow, I guess, right now. Let me, yeah, it's still processing some of these. I'll do just one more time. Fewer tables.
It knows when you're running a demo to be slow.
Yeah. When you have so many things. Okay. Yeah, I think something happening. Yeah, you see, this is coming to bringing those. And even if it is a function, even if it is a table that table comes from many other tables, it brings them all. Even if it is folders, you just go and select folders in that case. Like I can go and select this folder, hold the Control key, this folder and this folder, then copy it and come here and paste, and it will bring them all. Then after bringing this here, you should go and do some configuration in terms of like the gateway, because these that I have used, most of them are using from the on-prem source. I need to go and set up the gateway, then credential for the data source. But you set up usually the gateway one per your data source. Then all of the queries might go fine, right? So even moving like a bunch of tables over there is not really a big deal. It's easy. Now, back to my slide. One of the things you need to consider when you are creating data flows, so data flows are good, but now you have to also think about what type of data flow you are using. Like some of the discussions we had was good in terms of like having your own storage as your data lake Gen 2, or using the internal storage, or common data services. I can't still roll that Dataflex Pro in my mouth, but things like that. There are different types. We have a concept of standard data flow and analytical data flow. Now, this is a whole big topic itself if I want to talk about it, but consider it this way. Analytical data flow is a data flow that stores the data in Azure Data Lake storage, Gen 2, or like the internal storage is also considered as analytical. It gives you some AI features you can use. Standard data flow, on the other hand side, doesn't give you AI features, but it is something that you can store in a common data services. Dataflex Pro. You can use it to store data into Dataflex Pro, right? Which is quite a bit of different. You can create a standard data flow using Power Platform data flows, which is what you create in Power Apps Portal or Customer Insight Portal in Dynamics 365, versus analytical data flow is something you can create in those places, also in Power BI. And choosing bringing your own storage, or should you use internal storage? All of these are options you have to think about. Like, do you want this result of a data flow to be used only in Power BI, or you might use it in your other applications, like a Power Apps application? In that case, probably like a standard data flow is better. If you are going to use some AI functions, probably analytical is better. Your access options, like things that we already talked about, few of those things, like how the access works. The features that you get, like what I mentioned about the AI functionalities. These are important to choose the type of data flow that you have. But the good thing about it is that you can easily change a data flow from one to another. How you can do that? Every data flow, actually the whole thing in a data flow is stored as a JSON file, the metadata of that. You can just export that JSON file. Let's say if it is an analytical data flow. And then if you want to create like a standard data flow from that, you just go and build a data flow with using that JSON file, then you do some configuration and finally just refresh it, right? So it's not really hard switch between these. These are quite easy. As I'm saying, these are really big topics, every one of these, if I'm going to talk about these in details. Troubleshooting is another thing when you move your queries into the data flow. There are some errors you might get because you don't have access to the source. There are some errors you might get because of the licensing. Like, for example, we have a concept of linked and computed entity. Computed entity is an entity that is referenced from some other entities, but the source entity is still loading, right? That is a scenario that you need a premium license for that in Power BI data flows. Or linked entity, when you have an entity in another data flow and use the data flow to get data from that entity. These are premium in Power BI environment. They have done a little bit different in Power Platform environment. So you need to be careful about that. The type of license that you have covers these or not. Handling errors is also quite different. In Power BI desktop, when you refresh, you get the error immediately coming up as a message. You can click on view errors. It brings Power Query editor for you, show you some of those errors. We don't have that luxury in Dataflow or let's say Power Query Online. You need to take care of those errors beforehand. I have a set of articles and sessions I've done in last year was about how to handle these errors. Some tricks I mentioned that you can track if there's an error happening and find out which column there was an error on and show the errors. And I think Mark Walter presented a session about that in your user group, if I'm right.
Yeah.
Yep. So use methods like that to troubleshoot and find errors before it happens, because it's not like desktop environment that you see everything just in front of your face. There are some best practices that I do recommend thinking about. Like I suggest things such as splitting your data flows into multiple workspaces. Why you might want to do that? Consider it this way. Let's say I have like 20 tables that I want to create a data flow based on that. And now some of these tables are like generic tables, like date, time, currency, which I want to give everyone access, every data modeler in my organization access to use that. But some of these tables are a little bit more sensitive, like sales data. I just want to give this access to the sales data, the sales that is in a sales data flow or something like that, to only like a data modeler in the sales team. So what I do, I create like a workspace general data sets. I put like date, time, currency, things like that in there, give access to those, and put some of those that are a little bit more sensitive in other workspaces. This is also a good example of why you might want to separate things into different workspaces, into different data flows. One reason is that. Another reason is that you separate into different data flows if you want them to be scheduled on a different refreshed on a different schedules, right? For example, you have your sales data that you want to refresh it, let's say every 4 hours, every hours, but your product mapping table just refreshes once a week, right? This is a good reason to split it into data flows. Having the concept of staging data flows and transformation data flows, really powerful concept. I have actually all of these things that I'm talking about, I have worked like on 16 articles that is coming as Power Query data flow documentation, hopefully sometime soon. So keep an eye on those. Those are coming soon, and you can read more details about that. But one of the things is this, like staging data flows and transformation data flows. You make your data flows source independent if you have staging data flows. Let's say I'm getting data from a system that is like DB2 or something like that, right? I'm building data flows with that, and transformation is in that data flow as well. Now, the problem is that if I upgrade that system, not me, let's say someone else in the organization, upgrade that system to a new system, I have to come to this data flow and change everything, right? Because everything is in this data flow, versus if I have the scenario of like one staging data flow, the staging data flow just got data from that source. And then I have transformation data flow that got data from the result of staging data flow and did the transformation. If I have that layers, then I just need to go and change my staging data flows. It makes it much easier. Staging data flow is not just good for that scenario. It's good for other scenarios as well. Like your source system might be slow. So you schedule all of your staging data flows at a time that is not a peak time, that is a time that that system might perform a little bit better for fetching those data. You don't affect the users of that operating system. Things like that. Using computed entity helps a lot, because this is a type of entity that stores the data and other entities gets the data from it. Using that, you can use also a specific thing called enhanced compute engine. This is something that not only gives you direct query access to the data flows, but it also enables a particular powerful engine on this entity that makes things faster. Your merge operations, your group by operations, which are normally slower, would become faster. It gives parallel access to that. Like one of the questions I get is, what if I have like one entity and then I'm using that entity in like 10 different places? Because this is a file, a CSV file, I cannot really have parallel access to this, right? I have to like do this like sequentially. This gets data, then the second one, then the third one. If you use enhanced compute engine, what happens behind the scene under the hood is that this will be loaded into the SQL engine in that compute, let's say, scenario. Now, at the moment, it's a SQL engine. Later on, it might be something else, right? And then it will give access to like parallel querying the data and some other really important things. Talking about like architecture question that we had, like one of the things that I do recommend you to use whenever you are using like Dataflow is to consider an architecture like this, like something that have your data transformation in the data flow. So you can have your queries that are doing data transformation in a data flow. In Power BI, you just load that data. Mostly for queries that you think can be used or probably is going to be used in another file somewhere else. Those are really good candidates to be in a data flow. Date table, time table, currency table, product table, customer table, even your fact tables. If you are going to use that across multiple models, then do it in a data flow. And in data flow, you have to, again, have like a sub layers, like staging, transformation on top of transformation, right? Then I use shared data sets. What is shared data set? It's basically a Power BI without a report, a Power BI that gets data from, let's say, Dataflow in this case we are talking about. It has DAX and calculations and relationships in it. and then is used to feed data into the reports. Then you have like Power BI reports with the live connection getting that data. This is like the 3 layers of architecture that helps your overall Power BI implementation. And I have like sessions for this, which you can go and watch it on YouTube, different places I've presented that. Checking if there is any other questions, but before that, I'm just mentioning this as well. I have a Power BI video course on our academy. You can feel free to access to it. We have like a 2 days trial period on that. And this is a $30 discount code for the first month of Academy membership. Feel free to use it. Lots of free videos on our YouTube channel and articles I publish like every week on different aspects of Power BI. Make sure watch for that 16 Dataflow articles coming, and you'll get a lot of things under that. So
that's going to be huge. Let's get some snaps for Reza. If y'all want to get off mute and join us. Fantastic work, Reza. If you want also, if you want to drop some of those links into the chat so everybody can click on them easier and get to your content, the better. I'm going to throw some tweets. I took a screenshot of that architecture and I'm going to tweet about it. I think that was really awesome. So great. Does anybody have any questions? Let's open up the floor. We got some time for questions.
I have one, Reza. Do you know if data flows can be used with template apps? So like template apps, as I understand it, get published out and they contain data sets and reports. Can data flows go into another customer's tenant and be then reused across their tenant?
Yeah, very good question. I haven't tested it to say for sure, but I think this should be something possible. But yeah, don't take my word on it because I haven't really created a template app that has a data flow to see is it really working. It is transferable to the customer tenant. But it's a good question. I might do a blog on that.
Cool. I'll wait for it.
Right.
So I've got a question. So I've done the SQL data flow, but can you create calculated tables based on that and measures potentially?
You mean a SQL data flow? You mean like SSIS or what do you mean?
Yeah, so basically making a call to a SQL database and creating that into a data flow, a basic table. But my question is, can I then take that data and manipulate it through DAX, like to create calculated columns or even measures and essentially propagate that?
Yeah, the thing is that like data flow is all about, let me bring that piece back. Data flow is all about Power Query. You won't be able to create measures. You would be able to create calculated columns, but not with DAX, with Power Query. And if you are creating calculated column, this is my suggestion to do that in Power Query as much as you can. Some specific calculated columns, need to be done in DAX, but most of them can be done in Power Query. If you need to do DAX and things like that, do that in your shared dataset. Like keep them separate. Do your calculated columns or all of your pre-calculations in the data flow using Power Query. Then have your shared dataset with your DAX measures and other calculations on top of it, and then your reporting and visualizations.
Okay, so that was kind of a follow-on question then. Is there anything on the horizon to essentially create something similar to a data flow except to propagate essentially DAX functions that you create within the model?
You mean like your data source has DAX measures getting data from it? Is that what you're asking?
Well, so we're reusing measures within our data set. And so the question is there going to be a parallel data flow for measures? So where you can reuse measures. I don't see it on the horizon.
I'm going to talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
In my presentation. And Reza, what I'm thinking of is the next gen composite models.
Right. Okay. Yep. That's what I was going to mention as well. So the thing is that like data flow is not going to be like replacement of DAX measure, never, because DAX is like dynamic when we talk about measures. That is something you need to do like in your in-memory storage. But the way that you can do that is with what Paul is going to explain, and I believe he would explain it much better than I would.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you
Cheers.
both.
And it's all vaporware at this point. There's nothing to show, but it's announced. It's on the roadmap, so we can talk
Yes,
about it now.
it is. Right.
Any other questions?
Mm.
Oh, I think I see one. Can you use data flows with SSAS as a data source? Did we already talk about that?
Yes, yeah. Like one of the sources is analysis services. Yep, you can do that for sure.
Thank you so much for making the time and to be with us, and hopefully we can have you again.